Welcome to presentation number 24 in our series Rereading Revelation. We have now come to chapter 20, and the title for today's topic is The 1,000 Years. And then, after that, this is our text, and here same headline. And this is a short chapter. There is one chapter shorter than this one, chapter 10. And we are, here is the outline. First, Satan bound for 1,000 years. Then Satan released. And then the last judgment. So here, in Albrecht Dürer's depiction, here is the binding of Satan and putting him away here for 1,000 years. And there is the New Jerusalem here. So we are reaching the ending of the story. I have magnified the detail here. Here is a magnified picture, the angel with the key and the chain, and here with this extremely ugly, monstrous figure, this is then depicting Satan being put away. But because there are such challenging issues here, Satan is bound, and then he is released. Those are such challenging conceptions. So we are only going to do 10 verses. That's all on the menu for today. That's all we can handle. And in our overview, again, here are some very strong connections radiating from chapter 12 to the chapter we are doing today, chapter 20. So here, from chapter 12 to chapter 20, we have our topic defined for us in the most explicit, most in-your-face way that is possible. So, under the headline, Action at Last, as it were, we read, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the Slanderer and the adversary, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit. Threw it into the pit and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more, until the 1,000 years were ended." And I have highlighted a couple of things here. So the nouns I have underlined: the dragon, that ancient serpent, the slanderer, the adversary. Those are words for the devil and Satan. So here you're reading his identity. This is the one against whom all this action is unleashed. And then the verbs: seized, bound, threw, locked, sealed. We have reason to think what those verbs might mean, and we will look at it, at that also in a moment. But look at this. So here is chapter 12, the central chapter, the passage where the war in heaven is described, and where we get to know who is the adversary. And let's read that one too. "The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the Slanderer and the adversary and the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." And then he is wreaking havoc in the world. This is in the cosmic perspective at the point of origin. Now, here is the same perspective at the point of its ending. And the same thing, it is as though Revelation takes a certain joy in spelling it out for us here. the dragon, the ancient serpent, the slanderer, the adversary, now coming to an end, as it were. So here are the illustrations from the Cambrai apocalypse, the angel coming down with the key and the chain and seizing the dragon and locking him into the bottomless pit and turning the key, as it were. Same thing here in the Trinity apocalypse, more elaborate. The angel with the chain and the key seizing the dragon and locking him away here in the bottomless pit. So this is the story. This is what that's a pictorial representation of what our text has given us. And at the end then, this is a kind of scene we have. God has put, as it were, Satan behind bars. And there is a kind of sigh of relief. Why? There was, action at last. And we feel pretty good about that. Until we read this. Until we read the rest of verse 3. After that, he must be released for a little while. And we shake our heads. We wonder what in the world is going on here. We come to this text with a question mark, and if you don't come to this text with a question mark, you have not paid attention. Then you have read this book as story only, and not as an account that has a plot. This is at the center. We are in a plot territory now, and this is the best I can do. That's how we feel in the presence of such a disclosure. So what about scholars? How have they handled this one? And when I wrote my dissertation at the University of St. Andrews, I actually started with chapter 20. I started with the ending of the book because I wanted to use that as leverage for a more serious engagement with Revelation's plot. So here is R.H. Charles, who wrote a 2-volume commentary 100 years ago, still a very valuable book, very impressive work. But when he comes to Revelation 20, to the text we have just read, he finds a problem there. He says there is a defect in the text. This is what he postulates. He says that John died when he had completed the part, chapter 1 through 20, verse 3. He died when he had completed that part, and the materials for its completion, the rest of chapter 20 and chapters 21 and 22, which were for the most part ready in a series of independent documents, were put together by a faithful but unintelligent disciple in the order which he thought right. Well, he didn't do a very good job. So John, he died prematurely. He hadn't finished the book, but he had left some papers on his desk, and his disciples came and looked at it and said, what can we do with this material? So the notion here of John dying a premature death before he could finish is a postulate served to us by R.H. Charles. It's not going to work. It isn't necessary to resort to such desperate measures or other answers, other searches for answers here that are also kind of the counsel of despair, as it were. Two great German scholars, they say that when we get to this part of Revelation, the author is getting tired. He simply doesn't have more energy, so it sort of peters out with no momentum toward the end. It doesn't work. Or someone else says that it is alien theology, that this is not Jewish Christian, genuine Jewish Christian thinking. This is an impostor who serves this, so we don't really have to take it seriously because it is sort of from an alien thought world. And another one says, well, he's just following a rigid script. It doesn't matter what it means because he's just going through the motions of a certain script to which he feels obligated. Or this last one, that, well, the end of the world is coming. It's the end of the story. We need to do some pyrotechnics, we need to stage it in a way that the world sort of ends with a bang. And so that is another view. But these are quite desperate answers and quite inattentive to the plot that has been built in and to the momentum that is building in Revelation story. We're not going to settle for any of these. And here, though, are some questions that people ask, that scholars ask, excellent questions, even though the means, or even though the scholars' response to these questions is quite inadequate. So here again we have Satan bound in Dürer's representation, and then we have Austin Ferrer, whose work about 50 years ago, excellent work on Revelation, and good question too. But why is Satan merely bound? And why is he ever to be loosed again? That's a good question. That's a plot question, not just a story question. It's a big, big why in there. And here is J.P.M. Sweet, whom I have met at the University of St. Andrews, and who was as sweet as his name. He says, why could he not have been liquidated from the beginning? Another good why question. Why is he released again? Well, if you can bind him, why didn't you bind him earlier? And if you're planning to annihilate him, why didn't you annihilate him earlier? Those are some of the thoughts here. And this, here we have it. James Resigue, who has written a couple of books on Revelation, and I have recommended one of them on the back cover. He says, why not simply destroy Satan at the beginning of the 1,000-year period? Yes, why not binding him and releasing him? That is really strange. What is the point? Indeed, good questions. So let's see what I will answer to these, and I have answered them like this somewhat in my dissertation under the headline, The End and the Beginning. So here are my proposals. The binding, 1,000-year imprisonment, and subsequent release of Satan establishes Satan as an important character in the story. You are not going to get this right, I say to my fellow interpreters of the book of Revelation, if you thought that Satan in the story was a mere sideshow, a kind of cardboard figure. That is not going to be a good view of the book. And then number 2, that Satan belongs to a category of beings that is distinct from humans. He is not human, he isn't God, but he is an important figure, non-human figure, an angelic figure. That's what he is. And then my third point, the ending of the story is likely to be related to the beginning, as all good stories go, and as all good stories that have a plot go. So we must look to the beginning. We must look there to the beginning if we wish to understand the plot, and that we plan to do before we finish this presentation. We can read on now. Then I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority. And here I have expanded a little authority to weigh evidence and judge. I also saw those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, that reveals the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So here we have a recapitulation of much of the story, testimony of Jesus that reveals the word of God. We have the beast and the image and the mark of the beast, as it were, and we have people who were dead, who come back to life. God makes it up to them. And this is one scene from a resurrection scene of at the beginning of the 1,000 years. There is a calling back to life people who had been victims of violence or those who have died. And we have also here this is a picture in a church in Istanbul, Christ in Kora, it is called, Christ outside in the countryside. And I have seen it, and I think it is one of the most amazing depictions of resurrection that you can see here, the defeat of evil and those who died coming back to life. So let's read a text here, more text. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. So there are many who are dead. Some are resurrected at the beginning of the 1,000 years, some at the end of the 1,000 years. This is the first resurrection before the 1,000 years. Blessed, unholy, fortunate are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. Let's read more. Or let's look at this summary now, a summary of the 1,000 years of the text we have read so far. So Satan is bound for 1,000 years. Satan is bound until the 1,000 years are ended. The resurrected victims of violence reign with Christ 1,000 years. So coming before this starts at the beginning of the 1,000-year period. The rest, those who are not in that group, they are not resurrected until the 1,000 years were ended. It's very clear. It is very pointed. The resurrected, they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. And then Satan is released when the 1,000 years are ended. So how can we make sense of this? We'll look at the summary slide in a moment. Here they are resurrected. The victims of violence are resurrected here. And I think I had one, I had that's the illustration here, just to show the resurrection of the victims of violence at the beginning of the 1,000 years. So here is a problem, because Revelation seems to assume something about what happens when the believers are resurrected. Revelation seems to assume what happens then more than it spells it out. So I have a slide here about going to heaven in the New Testament. So the usual narrative in the New Testament and in Christianity is that at the end of history, Jesus comes back to the earth, there will be a resurrection, and the redeemed will go with Jesus to heaven. So you're resurrected and you go to heaven. Some people believe that we have immortal souls, and that the immortal souls go to heaven when you die. I don't think that is the teaching of the New Testament, but the afterlife is a life in heaven. That is the basic in the Christian narrative. And there is some support for this. Not that you go to heaven when you die, but that you do eventually go to heaven. The redeemed go to heaven. So here is Paul in his first letter, the first of Paul's letters, written to the Thessalonians, first letter he wrote to that community. And he says that the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. And this is read, and probably correctly read, as a text of resurrection and going to heaven, to spend eternity, as it were, with God in heaven. So, does Revelation believe in that scenario? It is almost like I have to say, barely. But I will say yes. There is one text showing that the redeemed actually do seem to go to heaven. Here, the story of the two witnesses in Revelation 11. And they are victims of violence. They are killed, and they lie unburied in the streets of the great city. And then after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them. And they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice, those victims, they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. That is as clear, or that is actually the only text in the book of Revelation showing or indicating the redeemed going to heaven. So here is the Deus Apocalypse illustrating that. The two witnesses are dead here. They come back to life, and here you can see their feet as they disappear in a cloud to heaven. That is a Revelation's view. So there is a kind of going to heaven in Revelation 2 at the point of resurrection. But what is explicit in Revelation, and much more explicit, is that there is not only movement from earth to heaven. There is movement from heaven to earth, that the redeemed do not spend. If they go to heaven, they do not spend eternity in heaven. They spend eternity on earth. They come down from heaven to earth. And God will also come down. We will read that in a future presentation on chapter 21. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So the new Jerusalem, the holy city, is the city of the redeemed. It is a city of people, and it is called the bride. So, and we have explored what that means. So here that city of people comes down from heaven, and that is unique to Revelation. You do not see that in any other book in the New Testament, at least not to that extent. And I made my slide, the city comes down. I usually make my slides the pictures come up from below, but here it comes from above to simulate the direction of what happens here. So looking now at this overview, 1,000 years before and after, what do we have? We have in the before column that Satan is bound. That's what the text says. We have a first resurrection, and we have now made a case for an ascent to heaven, that the redeemed are resurrected, and yes, they go to heaven. And then after the 1,000 years, we have the text says that Satan is released, and that there is a second resurrection of people who are not redeemed. And then we have a descent from heaven, that the redeemed come back to earth from heaven after the 1,000 years. And Then what happens then on earth during the 1,000 years? Well, this is what we have on earth. We have desolation. We do not have flourishing. We do not have celebration. We have an earth lying desolate while the redeemed are in heaven. That's what we are seeing. And here is an attempt to depict this. This is not Anselm Kiefer intending to describe the millennium, but it is an illustration. I am using a desolation landscape, a World War II desolation landscape called Black Flakes that I use to illustrate what is happening on earth. So, just to show that there is a kind of Old Testament background material for this perception that the earth is going down, that the earth is failing, and the earth that was once created is at some point decreated. And we have text in Isaiah and text in Jeremiah to that effect. Here is Isaiah. The earth shall be utterly laid waste and utterly despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. A curse devours the earth, and few people are left. And I had this illustration from Revelation. This is the desolation, the scene of desolation at the harvest of grapes in Revelation 14, and the winepress and the blood flowing and the utter carnage and desolation that is depicted there. And then we have this text from Jeremiah. This is a text of decreation, reversing the sequence of the days of creation. I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. This is Genesis 1. Genesis 1 says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was empty and was void, was dark and void, as it were, and we're back to that point here. I looked at the earth as though back to the point before which it was created. I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light, no sun, no stars, no moon. I looked on the mountains, and lo, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and lo, there was no one at all, and all the birds of the air had fled. So here we have Old Testament visions of an earth coming, sort of being laid waste, as it were. So, to illustrate again what we're seeing here, this is in Revelation, the announcement of the fall of Babylon, the sort of collapse of civilization, as it were, and a kind of preparation for a kind of millennial uninhabited world, as it were. And so, how does this add up? A millennial earth. These are the points. Key Old Testament and New Testament texts paint a picture of the millennial earth not as a golden age, but as a wasteland. And Satan, and this is the crux of the matter in relation to the text of the binding and release of Satan. Listen to this proposal. Satan is not bound coercively, but is bound by force of circumstances. So we have a muscular action described in Revelation 20 on the part of an angel that comes from heaven, only to realize that this text of a forceful intervention actually doesn't quite mean that he is bound by circumstances. So here we have Satan bound, figuratively speaking, but things are not completely the way that our imagination may have been led to see it. And here again, we have the Trinity Apocalypse, the binding of Satan here, and then we realize that there are certain things in the circumstances here that really control the narrative. Resurrection, going to heaven. The others not resurrected. So the earth, what is happening on earth? There is nothing there. And Satan is then bound by circumstances, as it were. Satan's release and the second resurrection are parallel events. And the latter is the premise for the former. That is to say, the second resurrection is the premise for Satan's release. That's where we are. So now I want to revisit these terms that I had highlighted earlier, because Revelation begins by using this kind of language. He seized the angel and bound and threw and locked and sealed. Those are really very strong active verbs. I have learned in writing that when you write a sentence, you need to look for the verb, the best, most robust verb you can find. And we have to say that the writer of Revelation really did an amazing job with the verbs he used for the binding of Satan. And the action that our artists have seen corresponding to this is Matthias Gerung and the angel with the key and the taking Satan captive here. And we have an even better one. This is William Blake. I mean, look at that angel. He is up to something, and he seizes the dragon and he has the chain and he has a key and it's game over, as it were. Until we realize, as I have said earlier in Revelation, beware of hyperbole. Beware of language that is intentionally exaggerated, because that is really what we have here. Look that there is a kind of distance between the words used and the meaning of those words. So here, wow, bound by circumstances. That is where we are ending, even though these are the words, these are the terms used. And now we can read on. After the 1,000 years, when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth. Why in the world would you want to release someone when that's what he is planning to do? He will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for war. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And I have to digress for a moment here, because I have been looking on television the last few days, seeing a column of military vehicles approaching the city of Kyiv in Ukraine, and seeming to plan to do what Revelation depicts in relation to the New Jerusalem, surrounding the city, and the city seeming to be doomed, as it were. And here we have then Satan released from his prison and picking up where he left off, going forth to deceive, to make war, and to attack the city, thinking that he might still prevail. So here we have the Cambrai apocalypse, the dragon mobilizing his soldiers, and here we have the city and all those anxious faces looking over the walls, wondering what is going to happen. And we have the Deuce apocalypse, a much denser illustration, the city completely surrounded by a hostile army, and seeming to be, it seemed to me, it could seem like it is a kind of winnable war, as it were. So what do we have? The last battle. The beloved city in this depiction that is surrounded is the New Jerusalem, newly descended from heaven, even though that isn't described fully until chapter 21. It's a done deal. There is no doubt that this is what is happening. And here we have the holy city coming down from heaven. It's a city of people. And then, yes, saying that explicitly, it is a city of people. It's the camp of the saints. And then Satan goes forth to deceive and to gather them for war against the city. And here we have that depiction again, mobilizing to attack the city. And then we have the figure of Gog and Magog, and they have Old Testament antecedents. So this is the picture we have. And then we read this text. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And I want to pause and make that a very important text, mostly because it is so badly read that this is kind of all the text, all that people remember from this scene, that as this hostile army is attacking the city, God will burn the army up and he will burn them alive. And the fire might last, in some scenarios it lasts forever. So let's just see how this might look when we take a look at more details here. Here is the Trinity Apocalypse. This is the city, and at the end, Satan is also defeated, and there is fire coming down from heaven. These are the elements we have in the story. Let's see what the meaning is. So, the end, verse 10 in chapter 20, fate of the deceiver, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tortured day and night forever and ever. That's what the text is saying. And notice that there is a throwing of the devil now into this hole, just as there was a kind of throwing of the two other accomplices at the end of chapter 19. So, beware of hyperbole. Let me say that again. Beware of intentional exaggerations. This is the text we have. The devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and to the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now look at this text at the beginning of the book. There was an angel coming down. He seized and bound and threw and locked and sealed. That's what we read at the beginning of the book. And then we had this depiction of what happens, and then we had this explanation of what happens. He was bound by circumstances. That is a pretty good example of hyperbole if my explanation is correct. So now we have a summary of this text again. Fire came down from heaven. Fire came down and consumed them. The devil was thrown and they will be tormented. So we're reading this and we want to ask this question. So here Satan was bound by circumstances. Here Satan is captured, and what captures him? What is going on here? These are the questions we have, and I want to put them next to each other. And here you see coming down, seized, bound, through, locked, sealed. Here came down, consumed, was thrown and tormented. Very strong verbs here too, like these. And then we said here, this is my question then. If we call this, on this side of the equation, the angel that comes down from heaven, if we call this figurative speech, if we call this circumstances, why do we call that literal speech? Why is that literal? Because it is in most scenarios, when this clearly isn't. That is a start place to begin. And now we are going into a court scene. We are going to transform the heavenly council into a jury trial. And we are going to have witnesses testifying, and they testify for the side of God. And I am positioning myself on that side, how to read Revelation's language of destruction and fire and fire coming down from heaven. And I will put it under the headline, what we see, what these testimonies bring out, are scenes of demonic ruin and not scenes of divine retribution. So here we are, and you and I are sitting in the jury, and we are watching this happening. So the first witness talks about fire from heaven in the first and second trumpet that is brought to earth by demonic powers. And the first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. This is a demonic mixture. And they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. It isn't good, and it is demonic destruction raining down on the earth. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. That's my first witness. Second witness. There is torture as by the sting of scorpions, by the monstrosity unleashed by the fallen star in the fifth trumpet. Listen to this. This is what demons do. This is not what God does. Not in a million years. They were commissioned to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. That is my second witness, or Revelation's second witness. A third one comes to the stand. Let's hear what he has to say, or she. There is destructive and murderous fire mediated by the demonic horde in the fifth and sixth trumpet. We're still early in the book. And this is how I saw the horses of the opposing side in my vision. The riders wore breastplates, the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur. The heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these three plagues, a third of humankind was killed by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. What are we seeing? We are seeing demonic ruin. We're not seeing divine retribution, not by any stretch of our imagination. That's called the fourth witness. The fourth witness, same setting. Now that we have seen fire and torture in place, the warning that fire and torture are the core and the legacy of the false side. This is the message of the third angel in Revelation. May be the text in Revelation that has been most misunderstood and most misconstrued. So there is a warning here. Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. That is what it is called. But what is it? They will be tortured with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torture goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. I have said this before, I will say it again. This is not a warning God gives that if you do that, I am going to torture you. This is a warning God gives that if you accept the deceptions of the beast and buy into that project, this is what will happen to you, because he will do it. He is the one who tortures. He is the one who burns with fire. It happens with the Lamb and angels as witnesses, but not as agents, not as perpetrators. This would be like God saying, I love you so much, and if you don't accept my love, if you don't reciprocate, I'm going to torture you. You cannot say that, and you don't need to say it, because in the text, God warns about what the other side is up to, what it will do. Okay, we have a few more testifying in our court scene. Scenes of carnage outside the city when the harvest is ripe and the evil side unravels, Revelation 14:20. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, where the losing army is located. And blood flowed from the winepress as high as the bridle of the horses for a distance of about 200 miles. That army is imploding. It is self-destructing. And there is another witness corroborating this, my sixth one, from the text in a non-canonical book, First Enoch, but a very, very useful text for this, corroborating evidence of a savage implosion in First Enoch. In those days, the father will be beaten together with his son in one place, and brothers shall fall together with their friends in death, until a stream shall flow with their blood. For a man shall not be able to withhold his hands from his sons, nor from his sons' sons, in order to kill them. Here, people who are close of kin are attacking each other. Nor is it possible for the sinner to withhold his hands from his honored brother. From dawn until the sun sets, they shall slay each other. The horse shall walk through the blood of sinners up to its chest, and the chariot shall sink down to its top. This is an army that is self-destructing, as evil self-destructs in the story of Revelation. Here, number 7. The harlot of Babylon is burned by fire by those who once enabled and supported her. And I have said this so many times now in my series that maybe you can say it in your sleep. Let me say it one more time, though. Here in Revelation 17, the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. These are of one mind and purpose in giving their power and authority to the beast. They are on the beast's side. And then a little later, and the 10 horns that you saw, and the beast, these will hate the prostitute. They will lay her waste and burn her naked. They will consume her flesh. They will burn her up with fire. So here, this entity is coming to grief because they start fighting among themselves. It is self-destruction once more. One more, 2 more, 3 more witnesses. The covering cherub that is depicted mostly in Revelation 18, or echoes in Revelation 18. But here is the story in Ezekiel about the covering cherub who traded in slander is destroyed by fire from within. By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade in slander, you profaned your sanctuaries. So I brought out fire from within you. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes of the earth in the sight of all who saw you. And maybe you don't believe me, but you can believe Moshe Greenberg and a few other Jewish interpreters who read this text, and they say, fire from your midst, fire from within, signifies evil causing its own destruction. That is what we have. And number 9, in the army of Gog and Magog, foreshadowed in Ezekiel and symbolically actualized in Revelation. The fighters turn on each other. Here is Ezekiel. I will summon the sword against Gog in all my mountains, says the Lord God. The swords of all will be against their comrades. That is a very interesting and important text. And now to number 10, the clinching evidence, the sort of bottom line. All of this is revealed to the heavenly council by the Lamb that was killed with violence. And that Lamb is now revealed to those who attack the city. And that is the reason why they, at last, turn on the dragon who deceived them. Let's read some text to corroborate my point. This is a depiction of the city. It is a see-through city. It is transparent. You can see everything from outside, as it were, including the center. It has the splendor of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl. And the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And here is the Trinity Apocalypse depicting the city and the center of the city and the Lamb in the middle or at the center. And it is a see-through city. You can see that too. That's the city they are attacking. And here, magnified picture of the center here. In the middle of the city, there is God and the Lamb on the throne and the river of life flowing from the throne. So we have the text for that too. And then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, see through everything. It's kind of luminous, shining. It's revelatory, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb in the middle of the street of the city. That's what we are looking at here. And this is in the Jews Apocalypse. The angel is so eager. He wanted to show him that too. And here is the middle of the city and the Lamb in the middle of the city, now visible to the attackers. They see that too. So let's see then that what we do know, we are back in our court scene here, and I'm changing that text now from this demonic ruin, not divine retribution, and now to this one, divine revelation, not divine retribution. I hope my point is reasonably clear. After that, our text said, he must be released for a little while. And we come back with our question mark. What is the point? Well, what is the point? Well, we said we need to go to the beginning of the story of the Ancient Serpent, of Paradise Lost in Lucas Cranach's depiction. What happened here when the serpent made its first entry? The Ancient Serpent and the serpent in Genesis. And we read that the serpent in Genesis was more crafty, more devious than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? Did God say that? We can't do the story in detail now. The serpent says, there is a generosity deficit in God. There is a freedom deficit in God. Those are the legacy of the serpent. That's what he says. And he could have said, and that is what I have said in my book, God of Sense and Traditions of Nonsense, that the divine command, its tenor and intent was not prohibition, it was permission, it was promotion, it was protection. So the serpent made stuff up, but he did say, what we have summarized, what I summarized here. And now looking for the plot in this story, the logic of Satan's release. And here is what I have said in my first book on Revelation. When the voice of the ancient serpent was heard in Genesis, it charged the divine government with a generosity deficit and a freedom deficit. There isn't freedom enough here, as it were. So this is what we have at the beginning of the story. But now we are at the ending of the story, and we are assuming that the ending is related to the beginning, that there is plot resolution. And so this one. It is the logic of freedom that leads to Satan's release. Someone who didn't believe in freedom would never do such a thing. But God is a believer in freedom. It is the logic of freedom that leads to Satan's release, and it is within the logic of freedom, precisely the value said to be lacking in God. Within that logic, Satan proceeds to work his own undoing, his own self-destruction. That is what we are seeing here. And this is the logic of Satan's release, Satan coming to grief in the light of Revelation. I'm not done. I have one more point I want to make. Here is the point. What settles this war, settles it for the side that wins, as well as for the side that loses, is the lamb that appears in the middle. This is the illustration for this. So in the beginning of Revelation, there is acclamation of the Lamb that appears in the middle. But at the end of Revelation, and it is a sight of relief for the winning side. It is a wonderful revelation for the winning side. But it is also at the center for the losing side as they march on the city, as they march on that see-through city. There is that lamb in the middle, and they realize that they have been deceived and that their cause is lost. What settles this war, settles it for the side that wins, as well as for the side that loses, is the lamb that appears in the middle.